Why is Africa still letting the world pull its strings? When will it finally stand up and fight back? Yes, we are asking the hard questions right from the get-go. You might think it's too bold, too in your face, but that's exactly the point. Africa has been outsmarted, outplayed, and outwitted for centuries. From colonial days to modern exploitation, it's been a consistent pattern. Except now, Doctor. Arikana is calling for a change. Her speech isn't just a wake-up call, it's a challenge to the entire continent. So, why has Africa allowed this to happen? Why does it still sit at the global table like a side dish, not the main course? Dr. Arikana cuts to the heart of the issue, pointing to a colonial history that has chained Africa's identity, economy, and future to the whims of the West. But here's the twist. Africa doesn't need to stay a victim. This video isn't just a recap of her speech. It's a blueprint for Africa's rise. So stick around, you'll want to know what happens next. Let's get started. Africa, why are you still running from yourself? Is it because you think your own identity is too weak, too backward, too African? Dr. Arikana insists it's because Africa was trained to reject itself. Colonialism didn't just steal land, it robbed Africa of its soul. How? Simple. Colonizers imposed their education systems, their languages, and their religions. They sold the idea that to be African was to be inferior, to be uncivilized. Let that sink in for a moment. The education system Africans still follow today is designed to reinforce the idea that the West is superior. European languages dominate the classroom, while African languages are pushed to the side like they don't even matter. Think about it. How many African kids are taught about the glory of their ancestors? How many learn about the rich cultures that once ruled vast empires? Instead, they memorize Shakespeare and Newton, as if European culture has a monopoly on intellect and history.
They don't want us knowing our history. They don't want us knowing where we came from. Because if you are a person without a history, who are you? Where do you come from?
This isn't just an educational issue, it's a psychological one. Africa's identity was shattered, and for too long, it has tried to put the pieces back together using the wrong glue. But here's the kicker. Africa's true power lies in embracing its history, culture, and identity. Only by doing this can the continent start to unite and finally throw off the chains of colonization. But everyone says, so what is African culture? What are the stories that can be taught instead of teaching Western heroes? If you've been taught anything about Africa's culture, it's likely a mishmash of stereotypes, tribal dances, wild animals, and poverty-stricken villages. But here's the thing. Africa's culture is far richer, more diverse, and more powerful than these narrow views allow. It's a mix of traditions, languages, history, and knowledge that has shaped human civilization for thousands of years. But the question is, why are we still teaching kids about Western heroes like Newton, Shakespeare, or Einstein, while African innovators, scientists, and philosophers remain hidden in the shadows? Why are African students taught that greatness lies only in the stories of Europeans? Dr. Arikana Chihombori has made it clear. Africa's cultural identity has been deliberately erased and replaced with the ideals of foreign powers. The time has come for African youth to reconnect with their roots and learn about the extraordinary people who shaped the continent's history. Take, for example, Imhotep, an ancient Egyptian polymath who is widely considered one of the first true scientists in history. Not only did he serve as a physician, but he was also an architect and engineer. His architectural genius is evident in the Step Pyramid of Djoser, one of the earliest pyramids ever built. He was so revered in his time that centuries later, the Greeks considered him the god of medicine. Why isn't Imhotep included in the curriculum as one of the greatest scientific minds of all time? Why is his legacy overshadowed by European figures? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Then, let's talk about Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, and physicist who made groundbreaking contributions to the understanding of African history and its cultural heritage. Diop was a fierce advocate for the idea that Egypt was a part of Africa and that ancient Egyptian civilization was, in fact, African. His work revolutionized African history and challenged centuries of Western dominance in academic fields. His writings should be required reading for every African student, or consider Dr. Margaret Ekpo, a Nigerian politician and women's rights activist who was instrumental in fighting for women's representation and participation in politics in Nigeria. She was one of the first female leaders in the country and a powerful symbol of African feminism. Why aren't we teaching young Africans about the heroes who shaped the political and social movements within the continent? Let's not forget Johnson Olumide Akinyemi, a Nigerian scholar who invented an early precursor to the modern-day transistor. His innovation in the field of electronics helped lay the groundwork for the global tech revolution. Why is this significant achievement barely recognized, especially when compared to the legacy of Western inventors like Thomas Edison? Instead of teaching kids about Western scientists and inventors who've had their names immortalized in the textbooks, why not teach them about Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, who implemented Ujamaa, an African-centered form of socialism aimed at reducing inequality and boosting communal development? Nyerere's ideas were grounded in the belief that Africa should solve its problems using African solutions. Isn't that the kind of leadership we need to be instilling in young minds today? The African curriculum should showcase its intellectuals and revolutionaries, from Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her environmental activism, to Dr. Ben Carson, a renowned neurosurgeon who became the first person to successfully separate conjoined twins. We should teach about Mansa Musa, one of the richest men to ever live, whose empire, the Mali Empire, was once the center of the world's gold trade, and Queen Nzinga of Angola, who led the resistance against Portuguese colonialism and was an iconic female warrior and ruler. In teaching about these figures, Africa doesn't just reconnect with its past, it empowers the future. The power of knowledge is transformative, and it's time Africa taught its children to look to their ancestors for inspiration, rather than looking to foreign lands. It's time to stop erasing African culture from history and start celebrating it. The beauty of Africa's culture lies in its diversity, its resilience, and its innovation. The world has learned so much from Africa over the centuries, yet it's been left out of the conversation. Dr. Chihombori Kwao's call to reconnect with African culture isn't just about looking backward, it's about looking forward. The more Africa embraces its identity, the more powerful it will become. When African youth see people who look like them succeeding, they'll understand that greatness is within their reach. They won't need to look to the West for validation. They'll know they're capable of anything. Now, here's a wild thought. What if the West feared what Africa could become if it embraced its identity? What if Africa's strength has always been there, buried beneath centuries of manipulation? The truth is, once Africa realizes its worth and stops running from its roots, the entire global power structure will shake. It won't just be about the past, it'll be about what happens next, and Africa can change everything. But the road to reclaiming that identity isn't just about education. It's about dismantling the colonial system still in place. And that brings us to the next more urgent question. How is Africa still paying for its past? The exploitation didn't end with political independence. It just took on a different, more insidious form. You're still paying for something that was supposed to end decades ago. While many African nations gained political independence, their economies remained shackled to the very powers that colonized them. Dr. Arikana pulls back the curtain on one of the darkest secrets of modern-day Africa: economic slavery. Let's talk about France. Yes, France, the country that's been helping African nations by controlling their financial reserves. It's not a conspiracy, it's an economic reality. 14 African nations still deposit a significant portion of their wealth with the French treasury. This is called the CFA franc system, a colonial-era agreement that forces these countries to keep their reserves in France, even as French companies continue to pillage Africa's resources. We are not even exaggerating here. France still controls the gold, oil, and uranium in former colonies, paying pennies on the dollar for Africa's wealth while African governments get none of the benefits. This is modern-day colonialism, and it's happening in plain sight. If that doesn't piss you off, we don't know what will. But here's the real kicker. Africa doesn't have to keep playing this game. Dr. Arikana makes it clear that Africa has all the resources it needs to prosper. The only thing standing in the way is a refusal to break free from the past. The very system that was created to keep Africa dependent is still being used today, and unless African nations collectively stand up, they'll remain stuck in this economic hellhole. Think about it. What if African nations started keeping their reserves at home, investing in their economies instead of sending them to foreign powers? What if they kept their resources for themselves and developed their industries? The wealth that flows out of Africa could easily stay within its borders and fund the kind of development the continent so desperately needs. But to do that, African nations have to get past their disunity. And that's what's holding them back. The continent's future is tied to unity. Without it, the cycle of exploitation will continue. And so, the next question becomes, how can Africa stop this? Well, it starts with taking back its resources, and that's exactly what we need to talk about. Africa is the world's treasure chest. The continent is home to a vast array of natural resources: gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, cobalt, timber, and countless others. But here's the catch. These resources aren't benefiting the people of Africa. They are being stolen by multinational corporations and foreign governments, often with the collusion of corrupt local leaders. Take, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo (DRC), which is home to more than half of the world's cobalt reserves, a mineral crucial for the production of smartphones, electric cars, and batteries. Despite its abundance of resources, the DRC remains one of the poorest nations on Earth. Why? Because foreign companies, especially those from the West, exploit these resources with little regard for the Congolese people. They extract cobalt and other minerals, pay low wages to local workers, and leave the country's infrastructure in ruins. The result? Africa is rich in resources, but the continent remains poor, its wealth siphoned away by foreign interests. The key to taking back control is to demand fair compensation for these resources. African nations must begin by rejecting exploitative deals. Look at Niger, for example. In recent years, the country has raised the price of uranium and begun to demand better deals with France, which has long benefited from the country's mineral wealth. By refusing to accept paltry compensation, Niger is taking a small but significant step toward reclaiming control of its resources. Other African nations should follow this lead and start negotiating deals that truly benefit their people. Africa needs to create local industries around its resources so that instead of simply exporting raw materials, it can develop its own manufacturing and processing industries. This would not only create jobs, but would also ensure that the wealth generated from African resources stays within the continent. Africa's leaders often fall prey to corruption, external pressures, and internal divisions, but this can be overcome. The first step in taking back Africa's resources is strengthening its institutions, economic, political, and legal. This means creating an environment where African governments can manage and safeguard their resources without being swayed by outside influence. The African Union (AU) can play a key role here, but it needs to be more than just a symbolic body. The AU needs to take a proactive role in shaping Africa's economic future by creating policies that protect the continent's resources. It needs to facilitate the creation of strong regional trading blocs that allow African nations to cooperate, negotiate, and develop collective strategies for resource management. Africa must also strengthen its legal frameworks to ensure that resources are extracted and used responsibly. This means putting an end to the illegal and environmentally destructive practices carried out by foreign companies. If African nations can pass strong environmental and resource management laws and ensure their enforcement, they can prevent multinational corporations from continuing to exploit the continent's wealth. While Africa has an abundance of natural resources, it's clear that the over-reliance on these resources is not a sustainable model. This leaves African economies vulnerable to price fluctuations in global markets, and it also prevents the continent from developing other sectors of its economy, like technology, manufacturing, and agriculture. Take Botswana, for example. Despite being one of the world's largest diamond producers, Botswana has managed to use its diamond wealth to build a stable economy. The country has reinvested diamond revenues into sectors like education, health, infrastructure, and governance. As a result, Botswana's economy has diversified, and the country has maintained a relatively high level of stability and development compared to many other African nations. Africa needs more countries like Botswana. The lesson here is that resources can be the starting point, but they should not be the end goal. The key to long-term prosperity lies in economic diversification. By reinvesting the wealth generated from natural resources into other sectors, African nations can build economies that are less dependent on raw material exports and more resilient to global economic shocks. The future of Africa doesn't lie solely in its natural resources. It lies in its people, specifically the continent's youth. Africa has the youngest population in the world, with more than 60% of its population under the age of 25. This demographic is a tremendous asset. Africa's youth are increasingly tech-savvy, entrepreneurial, and motivated to create their futures. Dr. Chihombori Kwao highlights the power of Africa's youth in her speeches. The continent's youth can drive Africa's resource revolution, not just by demanding better deals for Africa's wealth, but also by creating new industries. Africa's youth are already making waves in technology, social media, and entrepreneurship, proving that the continent's future lies not in exporting raw materials, but in building sustainable, homegrown industries. The African tech scene is rapidly growing, with countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa emerging as tech hubs. African startups are solving problems unique to the continent, and this innovation should be nurtured and supported by African governments. And then comes unity. Let's be real. Africa isn't a continent. It's a collection of states constantly bickering with each other. And guess who loves that? The West. Colonial powers carved up Africa with a straight edge and a ruler, drawing borders that made no sense. They didn't care about the people, only about the resources. Fast forward to today, and guess what? The divisions that were artificially created during colonialism are still there. South Africa and Nigeria. Two of the biggest economies in Africa, and yet they're often at each other's throats, fighting for dominance. Why? Because some African leaders still think they can win on their own, rather than working together. And what do foreign powers do in the meantime? They sit back and watch, knowing full well that divided nations are easy to control. It's almost like a bad movie. We've seen this before, right? But here's the twist. Africa's future isn't doomed to repeat this cycle. Unity is possible. Here's the final question. When will Africa finally stand up? Dr. Arikana is calling for unity, pride, and self-determination. She believes the youth of Africa can lead this revolution. They're already doing it, using social media, organizing, and spreading the message across the globe. But this fight isn't just about the youth. It's about everyone. Africa needs to rise as one. The time is now. Africa doesn't need to beg for respect. It needs to take it. The youth have the power to push this continent forward, but they need the support of their leaders and their people. So the real question is, will Africa take control of its destiny, or will it keep letting the world dictate its future? Dr. Arikana's vision is bold. She believes that Africa can rise, but only if it embraces its identity, rejects colonial systems, and takes back control of its resources. But here's the thing. Africa's future isn't set in stone. It's up to Africans, leaders and citizens alike, to decide what comes next. The time for change is now. Africa must stop fearing change and start believing in its power. The world is watching, and it's time to show them that Africa isn't just a passive player in global politics. It's time for Africa to take its place at the table, demand respect, and, most importantly, take control of its destiny. Do you think Africa can win back what belongs to itself? Can it gain respect and empower its people? Let us know in the comment section. How long will this take? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.